Is our porn drive and our sex drive the same thing? Well, the quick answer is no, and I believe that we do ourselves and our recovery a huge disservice when we get the two mixed up or see the two as the same thing. Today on Finding Traction, we talk about each of them, why it is important to distinguish between the two, and some insights that can help us as we progress in our porn recovery. Welcome aboard.
Ready?
When it comes to porn, are you stuck, spinning out, or slipping backwards in your life? If so, then welcome to the Finding Traction podcast, a show dedicated to those who are looking to gain recovery momentum away from porn and toward the life and relationships they have always hoped for. Now, here's your host, Vern Tomke.
Well, let me just say that before we get started, there's a couple things that I think can be of real help to you. First of all, I want to invite you to consider our Finding Traction groups. These are for guys that are wanting to make real progress in their porn recovery. Perhaps they're stuck, or they're finding that all of their efforts have not really availed them much. And in the Finding Traction groups, we meet weekly, and we work through a 52-week Finding Traction course video material. And we talk about it, we apply it to our lives, we check in with each other, and we check in throughout the weeks. And I really want to encourage you to consider that if you're needing to make real progress and getting the wheels back on your vehicle, so to speak. We also have the Finding Traction community. This is just a group that meets once a month, the last Sunday night of every month. And for $10 a month, essentially, you can be a part of that. It lets you be a part of guys that listen to Finding Traction. We answer questions, and I also send you each quarter a copy of the next quarter of our Finding Traction material. So if you want to make real progress, the Finding Traction groups are for you. And if you just want to connect with guys and, in one sense, have a maintenance program of just good, solid connections, consider the Finding Traction community group. Again, both of those, you can reach out to me at bandofbrothers.care@gmail.com. If you're interested in the Finding Traction community group, again, put community in the subject line. Okay, let's go back to this question. Porn drive versus sex drive. You might not actually have heard the word porn drive. I'm kind of making it up for the sake of this, but we want to talk about the distinctions between the two. You might be familiar with the term sex drive. And even if you do a quick Google search, most of the knowledge that I'm going to tell you here is pretty common. Again, any quick search would tell you some of this common material. First of all, let me just say this. Sex is a drive. It's not a need. Sometimes people think, I need to have sex. It's not a need. You actually won't die without sex. It's called a drive because it's, in one sense, an appetite or desire. And it's actually sometimes people who think that it's a need end up quoting Patrick Carnes. It's one of the most basic lies, for example, that sex addicts believe, that I need sex to survive. It's actually not true. It's my most important need. That's also not true. But it is a drive, it is an appetite, and other words have been used to describe it, words like libido or sexual desire. Those are different words that have been used to describe one's sex drive. And it's generally tied in with the chemical called testosterone. Now, your testosterone, which is tied in with your sex drive, generally peaks in your late teens, around 17 to 19 years old. But those levels generally stay high for the next couple of decades, for the next 10, 20 years. And it's not until you get into your 30s where your testosterone levels begin to decline. It's actually a very gradual process. Now, by the way, women's sex drive peaks in their 30s or 40s. Go figure with that. But we're here to talk about men. So, again, the hormone testosterone plays a huge part in our health and our sex drive. It also plays a huge part in one's sex performance. Again, testosterone level peaks early and tends to decrease with age. Once you get to about 40, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 years old, your testosterone levels begin to decrease or drop by about 1% per year. So, what does it mean? Well, in practical terms, after you get into your 40s, you tend to desire sex less often. And after you have an orgasm, it takes longer to recharge or to be ready to go again. Anybody who's over 40 or into their 40s can probably attest to that. Now, there's some variation there, but again, that's normal and natural. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't have a healthy sex life when you're older. It's just when you get into your 50s, both males and females report declines in interest in frequency of having sex, and just interest in sex in general. But once again, it doesn't mean, now if you're younger, this is not important to you, but if you're older, this is. It doesn't mean that you should expect to stop having sex as you get older. Research suggests that people in their 60s and 70s still report active, fulfilling sex life. It's just not as often. For example, adults who are in their 20s, who have a partner, roughly are having sex every 5 days or 80 times a year. They actually study these things. Adults in their 60s, for example, 40 years later, are having sex an average of 20 times a year or once every 18 days. So, again, you have quite a range in between there. The biggest decline in the frequencies tends to happen in the 50s, which makes sense when you look at the decline in one's sex drive. Now, let's ask this question. Is one's sexual libido a fixed thing? So are you just kind of left at whatever level you have, whether you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever? Actually, there's things that you can do to help and things that you can do to hurt your sex drive, your libido. So, for example, certain foods, good exercise, healthy amounts of sleep, maintaining a healthy weight is helpful for one's sex drive. The opposite, including, for example, the use of alcohol, excessive stress, being significantly overweight, eating unhealthy foods, can impair your sex drive. In other words, what you're saying, Vern, is just good physical and emotional health work in your favor, right? Or work against you. And I guess you could say it's not really that surprising. The healthier you are, the better it is for your libido. The more unhealthy you live, the less helpful it is for your libido. Now, there are some guys that talk a lot about having an abnormally high sex drive or testosterone level. It's interesting, by and large, they say that is a misnomer because oftentimes it's actually due to other factors that we're going to talk about in a minute here. Sometimes people think, well, if you have a naturally high testosterone, that makes men susceptible to things like road rage or aggression or sexual promiscuity. Again, studies have not shown that to be the case. Here's one of the things that I do find in talking with guys, especially as they get older. They get all concerned about their sex drive beginning to decrease. And they're all worried that they don't want sex as often as when they were 24, for example. They're now 54 or 44 or 64. And the answer is, well, it all comes down to your expectation. The key is it's normal and healthy to want less sex when you're older. You know, some 54-year-old guys are trying to live like they're 24, using testosterone or drugs or whatever that is. The answer is, well, why? What is going on with your expectations or how you view yourself? So, in general, what I'm telling you, sex drive peaks young and then begins to decline as you get older. But it's not a huge deal. Work with it. Adjust. It doesn't mean that you can't have a healthy sex life or feel happy and healthy about your relationship. We'll get to another stat which is really interesting in a minute, but let's take that. That is just a normal sexual pattern that happens with guys as they get older. And my phone just went off, but we'll come back to that. Okay, now let's talk about what I'm going to call a porn drive. Where a sex drive has to do with testosterone, a porn drive has to do with the chemical neurotransmitter called dopamine. Now, dopamine isn't just about sex. Dopamine is involved in helping us feel pleasure in anything. It's part of our brain's reward system that says that feels good. Sex could be shopping. It could be smelling cookies baking in the oven. All of those things can trigger a dopamine release or a dopamine rush. So the feel-good neurotransmitter called dopamine is involved in reinforcement. That's why when we try one of those cookies, we come back for another, or two, or three. Now, the darker side of dopamine is because of the intense feeling of reward that we get, our brain remembers it and says, I'll have some more, please, and some more, please, and some more, please. One cookie is not enough. Maybe I'll eat the whole plate of cookies. So, dopamine creates a sexual, we're talking now in the sexual area, it connects and creates a sexual reinforcement cycle that has little to do with one's physiological sex drive. It's just your brain remembering that felt good, I want more of what made me feel good. But what especially makes me feel good is something that is different from what I've had before, or novelty. There's a famous experiment called the Coolidge effect. And in this experiment, a male rat breeds with a female rat, but eventually gets tired or satiated and says, okay, that's enough now. However, if you introduce a brand new female, even though the male is tired, a novel, new, receptive female, all of a sudden the male rat goes, and I want to go again. And I want to go again. And every time you introduce a new, novel female, the male rat goes, and again, to the point where it literally can almost screw itself to death. That is called the Coolidge effect. That is a dopamine sexual reinforcement cycle that is reinforced by pleasure and novelty. Now, does any of that sound familiar to it? Well, most of us who have watched a lot of internet porn go, at the core, porn, especially internet porn, is all about a novelty addiction. It's not the same thing we look at over and over. It's about new image and new image and new image, new video and new video and new video. Different women, right? And here's what happens. Our brain goes, I like this. Let's do it again. Let's do it more. Let's do it differently. It likes the pleasure sensation it gets. And so it's like introducing one willing female rat after another. Now, this is one of the reasons, I'm an old fart, so you got to go back and remember that I started, basically introduced to porn through magazines. And that is itself was addicting, but the problem or the reality is the novelty factor wasn't as present. It was the same magazine. Maybe I would have 2 or 3 magazines stashed away, right? Nobody back in the day went into the store and said, give me every porn magazine you've got. And when are the next ones coming in? Or let's bring it a little bit further along. Let's call, your porn video store, the back room of where the porn videos were. Now, some of you will remember this. Nobody went in to the back room of the porn video. Well, maybe you did, but I don't know anybody who did, who went into the back room and took every last porn video and came out in a shopping cart of all 283 porn videos and says, I will have them all this week. And the store clerk goes, oh my, I guess everybody's going to have to wait till next week, right? We didn't do that. Maybe we would get 2 or 3 videos, right? But the bottom line is now online it is novelty, reinforcement, brain cookie. And you see that fuels and just turbocharges our porn drive. Is a good biblical word that's often used in biblical circles called lust. And lust, if you were going to create a great synonym for the word lust, is this word, more. Never satisfied, more. So when you have this continual turbocharged nitrous oxide porn drive that you are feeding into, what can happen, not always, but what can happen is it can hijack our pleasure centers. That's why you have, for example, increasingly being reported something called porn-induced erectile dysfunction. And all that means is the porn arousal response is so strong that it has completely hijacked a normal sexual arousal response. And so now your brain has become so conditioned, it overrides all normal responses and only can respond sexually to highly stimulating porn cues. All right? Now, not everybody experiences that, but you can see how porn plays in with that. So, we started by talking about sex drive. Sex drive is physical or physiological, and it all has to do with the thing called testosterone. The porn drive, however, is different. It has to do with the neurotransmitter called dopamine. And it's all about your brain, pleasure centers, remembering the cycle of reinforcement that becomes more and more ingrained through habitual use. Okay, so let's let's talk about a few takeaways by creating the distinction between these two. Here's the first one, and you might have other takeaways. I'd love it if you would even text me or email me some of your takeaways from this. Again, bandofbrothers.care@gmail.com. So here's the first one. Having a sexual partner, like in marriage or in a committed relationship, will not affect your longing for porn. Right? I often ask guys, so after you got, guys that were, habituated, conditioned by porn, And I'll ask guys this question. So how long after you're married did you start returning to porn in some, various forms? And invariably it's somewhere 3, 6, maybe 9 months, somewhere in that 3 to 9 month range. Let's go with 6 months in the middle. I get that kind of response typically. But the point is this: your brain has basically come to associate pleasure and porn together. So just having normal, real sex with a person doesn't have anything to do with that type of reinforcement. Yeah, they both have to do with your penis, but that's really it, right? Here's a really wild, fun fact. Did you know that the chemicals that you release in porn and masturbation, for example, are not the same chemicals that you release through normal sex? It's weird, but it's true. Look it up. So, I guess I'm here to give you the discouraging news that just getting married will not take away your struggle with porn. You're going to still have to deal with the habits you've created. Just getting married is not going to change your relationship with porn. Here's the second one, and this is kind of discouraging as well. Many people report actually they prefer a desire for the porn experience over the real life sex experience. Let me say that again. I've talked to guys that say, actually, pleasure-wise, the porn experience is better for me than the real life sex experience. Well, why is that? Well, if just pleasure is your goal, then, of course, with porn, you are in the driver's seat. And every time you can keep spinning the pleasure reward cycle over and over again rather than to interact with a real live person or just one person. Okay, that's 2. 3, porn and porn activities create actually an artificially inflated sexual arousal appetite that actually pressurizes your relationship for more frequent sex than would normally be the case if porn was not in the picture. So you've actually super inflated it's not your sex drive, but it's just this arousal template, this arousal appetite. If you want more information on that, you can go to episode 49 of this Finding Traction, which is called Wife-Sized Sex. And that has to do with the next one, where once you learn to reduce or eliminate your dependence on porn, it's actually going to allow your body to return to its normal physiological sex drive. And you're going to learn to be able to navigate that with your partner. Now, that's something that's easier to navigate. It doesn't pressurize your relationship. It doesn't cause sexual stress in your relationship because you're now returning to your normal physiological rhythms. Now, here is a fun fact. Now, this is, I told you I used to lead for years and years a marriage course. Do you know the age, let's go with the decade where people report the highest levels of marriage satisfaction, which includes sexual satisfaction? Okay? It's actually in your 50s. In your 50s. Now you might say, that's because you're not fighting with young kids and all the hassles of trying to start a career. For whatever reason, 50s generally is the sweet spot for most couples, with a major assumption I want to get to in a minute. But 50s, actually the second best decade is your 60s. And the third best decade is your 40s. Now, that has to do with normally growing older and knowing your partner, learning what works, learning to live together, all of that less pressurized, stressless, being in a relationship. However, porn will make a mockery of all of that. You will not experience that with porn, because porn will make it impossible to grow older with your partner. It will cause you to live with an inflated, jacked up arousal template. It will cause discontentment to enter into your relationship with your partner because you're wanting younger, harder, but whatever that is, you have been imprinted with wanting somebody who perpetually stays looking like they're, 20, 21, 22. It will rob you of all of that. Your porn drive will rob you from that, from just growing older and better with your partner. So I say to guys, you know what? If you learn to usher porn out of your life, you can return to a normal, healthy sex drive. And you could actually end up with the best relationship, even the best sex of your life. But porn will rob you of all of that, because once again, you're getting your porn drive mixed up with your sex drive. All right, just a few thoughts for you to think about. Curious what you think about it. Again, love to hear from you. My email is, once again, bandofbrothers.care@gmail.com. We'll see you next time.